In the previous video, we looked at how monopolies decide on what price and quantity to charge. Now let's compare a perfectly competitive market and a monopoly. So let's start with what we know about perfect competition. So let's start with what characteristics we need for a perfectly competitive market to exist. The first one was we needed a large number of buyers and sellers. Right? We needed lots of buyers, lots of sellers to be acting independently of each other, and this is what made them price takers. Because no particular company had any market power. No particular buyer had market power, which means that any particular company or buyer could not set the price. The price was taken as given. Then we needed to have perfect information. So as a buyer, you know what the different companies are selling for, and this allows you to buy from whomever is cheapest. Now, in order to buy from whomever is cheapest, you also need there to be no transaction costs. That is, there are no additional costs beyond the price that would make you favor one particular company or another. If you're really going to buy from whomever is cheapest, there can't be any additional hurdles to buy from one company versus the other, such as memberships, such as you have to travel an additional distance to get to one company. If you're going to buy solely based on price, then there has to be no additional costs for one company versus the other. We also need the goods to be homogeneous or homogeneous. In this case, they are the same. So it's the exact same product at the two different companies, so you're just going to buy from whomever is the cheapest. And the last one we had here is that there are no barriers, no significant barriers, to entry or exit. So if you recall, for the perfectly competitive market, if you see others making economic profit, you jump in and get some of that. And if you're not making economic profit in the long run, you could get out. Okay? Well, as we look at monopolies, when it comes to the monopoly, we have a big difference here in that we have barriers to entry. What were those three barriers to entry? Technical, legal, and economic. So monopolies are going to have barriers. Monopolies are also not price takers. Unlike the perfectly competitive market where no one has market power, monopolies have market power. Okay, so these two things are violated from that list of perfectly competitive markets, and it's going to therefore impact the monopoly in terms of how price and quantity are set, but it's also going to impact the economy in terms of whether or not we can achieve the benefits that exist of perfect competition. So those benefits of perfect competition, the first was that they had productive efficiency, meaning they operated at that minimum average total cost. We like perfectly competitive markets because that's where the per unit cost is the lowest. The company is the most efficient, and so that should mean that the cost savings gets passed on to the customer. Perfectly competitive markets are allocatively efficient. So they have allocative efficiency. Oh goodness. There we go. They have allocative efficiency. And you are allocatively efficient if you use your scarce resources to produce what customers want the most. So businesses are allocatively efficient if they produce until price is equal to marginal cost. And we are where demand and supply intersect on the supply curve. There were other benefits of perfectly competitive markets that we talked about. They encourage innovation. They are a costless system, and they allow for economic freedom. Costless system, meaning we don't have to have government intervention. Okay. Supply and demand determine who gets what and who does what. And economic freedom, people have the choice in terms of what they buy and what they do for a living. Now, monopolies, we've talked about a little bit already, are not a costless system. When we have natural monopolies, one way we ensure that cost savings gets passed on to the customer is that we have oversight bodies like the CRTC, like the Alberta Utilities Commission, to ensure that lower per unit cost gets passed on to the customer in terms of lower prices. So not a costless system. It also doesn't allow for economic freedom because there are barriers keeping you from doing the job or opening the business that you might want to do. Let's look now more at that productive and allocative efficiency aspect of the perfectly competitive market as we compare perfect competition and monopolies. So let's go back to our graph for how monopolies decide how much to produce and at what price. So recall that monopolies will produce until marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That determined the quantity for the monopoly. And then we looked at how much was the customer willing to pay, and that determined the price for the monopoly. So let's do a comparison now then of the monopoly versus the perfectly competitive market. Well, the perfectly competitive market was productively efficient. Where did we end up? Where was the price and the quantity in a perfectly competitive market? Well, in perfectly competitive markets, recall we produce until price is equal to marginal cost, and in the long run, we end up at a price, we end up at a price that is equal to the break-even price. So where would that be on this graph? Well, that is here. Let's see if I can get this to show up here. Let's change this color. That would be here at that minimum average total cost. So notice that the monopoly produces a lower quantity than the perfectly competitive market, right? It's not this quantity here, it's less. Okay, and in the perfectly competitive market, in the long run, we end up at that break-even price, which should be the lowest point on the average total cost curve. Okay, should be down here. So notice that that's not the price the monopoly is selling at. The monopoly intentionally produces less so they can charge more. So the quantity is less, the price is higher. Okay, so then where is economic capacity? Well, economic capacity is that quantity that goes with that minimum average total cost. So the perfectly competitive market is producing at economic capacity in the long run. Is the monopoly? No, the monopoly is producing at a quantity that is below economic capacity. Well, why did we like economic capacity as a society? We liked economic capacity because that's where the average total cost was at its lowest. Monopolies are not productively efficient because they intentionally produce less, and so they're not at that minimum average total cost. They're actually at a higher per unit cost than we would get with a perfectly competitive market. We're at a quantity that's below economic capacity. They're not productively efficient. Is the monopoly allocatively efficient? Well, what does it mean to be allocatively efficient? Use your scarce resources to produce what customers want the most. Perfectly competitive markets, we knew they were allocatively efficient because that's where demand and supply intersect. Well, does the monopoly produce where demand and supply intersect? Where would that be on this graph? We have demand. Where is supply? Well, the marginal cost curve represents the supply curve, and so that would be here, okay, for the market. So notice the monopoly is also not allocatively efficient. Well, how come I have 2 points here, a productively efficient point and an allocatively efficient point, if the perfectly competitive market is both? Well, that's because this marginal cost curve represents the marginal cost to the monopoly. So it's the market supply curve, okay? Because there's one company providing all the supply. In a perfectly competitive market, you have lots of companies, each with their own marginal cost curve, and so combined, they would be the market supply. So that's why they aren't the same point here, because this is one company monopoly acting as the entire market, whereas in a perfectly competitive market, you have lots of marginal cost curves making up individual supply, combined together make the market supply. All right, perfectly competitive markets. If we go back, perfectly competitive markets, right? They were productively efficient. They were allocatively efficient. We've just found that monopolies are not either. We know monopolies have barriers to entry, and the monopolies have market power. We know that monopolies intentionally produce less so they can charge more. When we looked at the perfectly competitive market, in the long run, we were at the break-even price, the economic capacity, and we had no economic profit. Well, what about the economic profit aspect? Well, what we see here is the monopoly has economic profit. Now, when you see this monopoly making economic profit, can you join in? Well, there's barriers to entry, legal, economic, technical, and because those barriers exist, you can't join in. So monopolies, they will intentionally produce less so they can charge more, and that will create economic profit. And because there are barriers, they will continue to get that economic profit in the short run and the long run. Downside to monopolies from a society perspective is that economic profit means that we don't have lower prices for customers. Remember that the quantity is below that economic capacity, so the quantity is not at its lowest per unit, and it's not being passed on to the customer. We're not allocatively efficient or productively efficient with the monopoly. So let's make a list of the problems that are created with monopolies. Okay, so let's add here. Let's add a page. Okay. All right. Problems with monopolies. The first one is that they get economic profit indefinitely. From a society's perspective, this is problematic because it keeps prices high. And it exists because there are barriers to entry keeping out the competition. So when others see the monopoly making economic profit, they can't come in and get a piece of it. All right, the second problem with monopolies is that they are not productively efficient. Right? Productively efficient means you're at the minimum average total cost. And what we saw here is that we're not at that minimum average total cost The monopoly intentionally produces less than economic capacity so that they can charge more. Monopolies are not allocatively efficient. You're allocatively efficient if you're using your scarce resources to produce what customers want the most. That is, the business is producing until the price is equal to marginal cost, and we're producing as much as the customers want, where demand and supply intersect. Okay. So when we look here at the monopoly, here's demand, here's supply, and we're not producing at the quantity where demand and supply intersect. The monopoly is not producing and using its scarce resources to make the amount that customers want. They are intentionally producing less so that they can charge more. So monopolies have economic profit indefinitely. They're not productively efficient. They're not allocatively efficient. They produce less so they can charge more. Okay, compared to a perfectly competitive market, the quantity is less, the price is higher. The fifth problem with a monopoly is that monopolies create income inequality. Well, how do they create income inequality? Well, because there are barriers to entry, you can't join in and get some of that economic profit. Those who own and run and work for the monopoly, they're going to make good money. But if you're the company that is trying to compete or get into the market, you're making no money. So it's going to create income inequality. And finally, the last problem with monopolies is that monopolies have market power. So they have power over price. So they have market power, which allows them to price discriminate. And we're going to look at in the next video what we mean by price discrimination and how monopolies price discriminate and why they do it.